My name's Debbie Lee. I'm the Festival Director of Melbourne Jewish Book Week. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, on whose stories traverse 60,000 years and on whose unceded land we're based. And I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Thank you so much to all of you for coming together tonight at short notice. So how did it happen and how did we pull it off? Every 3 months, Melbourne Jewish Book Week hosts a Zoom conversation with the Jewish Quarterly's essay for each issue. As you may know, the authors are generally in far-flung places, the UK, the US, Uruguay, Israel. You get the picture. The last global conversation with Yitskhok Rudashevski was focused on his essay, Whitewashed, Poland and the Jews, and that was a breakout success as it was held as a live Zoom as the opening session for Melbourne Jewish Book Week's festival. Jan was in Canada, where he is based, and the Jewish Quarterly editor, Jonathan Perlman, managed to get here all the way from Sydney to conduct the interview. So we established a new interstate/intercontinental experience. So how's this for one-upmanship? About a month ago, I contacted Jonathan and asked about the next JQ. He told me about the Rudashevski diary, and then nonchalantly happened to mention that Professor Samuel D. Kassow, who has written the introductory foreword, will be in town, care of the Jewish Holocaust Museum, as well as the Australian Centre for Jewish Civilization. So of course, I basically just said, well, why don't we do a live event? Which apparently hadn't been thought of. There wasn't much time to jump on the bandwagon, but fortunately, we have fantastic relations with our partner organisations. Everybody came to the party. I didn't know at the time that Sam was already lined up for several other events, although I assumed that might be the case, but we grabbed the date and we're delighted to be first cab off the rank. Here with me tonight are my counterparts, Dr. Stephen Cook, CEO of the Melbourne Holocaust Museum, and also Jonathan Perlman, who again has come from Sydney, and he is the editor of the Jewish Quarterly, as mentioned. We also have David Slucki, Director of the Australian Centre for Jewish Civilization, who will be conducting the interview with our guest of honour, Sam Kassow. I'll now hand over to Stephen to tell us a bit more about Sam and the various events that he will be presenting during the course of his stay, after which Jonathan will speak for a few minutes about the Jewish Quarterly and the inspiration for this particular issue ahead of the interview proper. I'll just note that we'll allow 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A, concise questions, and we'll also be selling the Jewish Quarterly down the front here at the end of the session, and Sam will be available to sign your copies. Thank you so much. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Debbie, and we are delighted to be a partner in this evening's event. Thanks to the Melbourne Jewish Book Week, the Jewish Quarterly, and Monash University's Australian Centre for Jewish Civilization. It is my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Samuel D. Kassow. As well as speaking this evening, Professor Kassow is here in Melbourne to launch the Melbourne Holocaust Museum's first special exhibition since our reopening. Shown for the first time outside Europe, the special exhibition is called Underground, the Hidden Archive of the Warsaw Ghetto. On display at our museum are rare artefacts from the Oneg Shabbat archive. And as most of you will know, the archive was led by historian Emanuel Ringelblum, who initiated an unprecedented campaign to collect material in the ghetto. The collection today known as the Ringelblum Archive. This collective of academics, writers and activists worked secretly in an attempt to document the mass murder of European Jews as it was happening. The exhibition tells the story of this act of resistance, a never-ending, arduous, harrowing, but ultimately successful attempt to write the story of the Holocaust from the perspective of its victims. And as well as material from the Ringelblum archive, we also have on show stories and artefacts from Melbourne Holocaust survivors who were in the Warsaw Ghetto, and we thank them and their descendants for the opportunity to share their stories. And I'm spruiking that the Underground will be open from the 17th of November to the 30th of March next year. Professor Kassow will also be speaking, and I'm going to do another plug, at another event which we're hosting. This will be a special screening of Roberta Grossman's film, Who Will Write Our History, about the Ringelblum archive. It's happening this Sunday, the 17th of November, at the Classic Cinema. Professor Kassow will introduce the film which is being held in partnership with the Jewish Quarterly, and we really thank them for their support. So please check out our website, mhm.org.au, for further details. I'd like to thank the ACJC, the Jewish Quarterly, and Irene Kronhill-Pletker for supporting Professor Kassow's visit, and also thank Jerry and Lillian Pierce and the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany for making Underground possible. I can think of no more appropriate person to speak to us about the Ringelblum archive and also about the Rudashevski diary from the Vilna Ghetto. Professor Samuel D. Kassow is the Charles H. Northam Professor of History at Trinity College and has been a visiting professor at many institutions, including the Hebrew University, Harvard University, the University of Toronto, and Dartmouth College, and he is a Fellow of the American Academy of Jewish Research. From 2006 until 2013, he was the lead historian for 2 galleries of the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, which opened in 2014. Professor Kassow is the author and editor of a number of books in Jewish and Russian history, including Who Will Write Our History?, Emanuel Ringelblum and the Secret Ghetto Archive, which was published by Indiana University Press in 2007. He has just completed an annotated translation of the Warsaw Ghetto memoirs of Raquel Aubach and is part of a team of historians writing history of the Holocaust in Poland for Yad Vashem. So please make Professor Kassow welcome. I'm now delighted to hand over to Jonathan Perlman, the editor of the Jewish Quarterly, to introduce our other speaker tonight and to give an overview of the evening. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve. It's a real pleasure to be here. We're also grateful to the partners and to Debbie and Steve for all the work you've done on this event. So I edit Jewish Quarterly, and just to just give a little introduction as to what that is. It's had a long history in Britain. It's a publication that's come out for about 75 years in the UK, but it now is based in Melbourne because recently it was taken over by the publisher Maury Schwartz, who's here tonight, and we've made a few changes to it. Firstly, it's now a global publication. So whilst it's published out of Melbourne, we are getting the best writers from around the world to write for an audience that includes the UK, Europe, Israel, America. The second change that we've made to the publication is that each issue now, instead of being a sort of magazine journal type format, each issue now is one piece of writing on what we think is the most pressing and important issue and most relevant issue to Jews today. So to give a couple of examples of just our most recent issues, our last issue was called Whitewash and dealt with Poland's just blatant failure, or the failure of modern Poland really to acknowledge the role that Poles played during the Holocaust. Really startling piece by Jan Grabowski, who's the world expert on Poland and the Holocaust. The issue before that was Blindness, October 7 and the Left. I think the title speaks for itself. By Hadley Freeman, the British-American journalist and writer. And our latest issue came about because actually Maury and I were meeting with YIVO, which some of you may know, the institute in New York, and the head of YIVO happened to mention that they were working on a new, really the first complete translation of this diary by Yitskhok Rudashevski. We asked if we could see a copy, and when we did, we were startled by it. It's an incredible artifact, really, but also an incredible testament to this one person's power of observation and power of writing. And he was just a a teenager when he kept these diaries in the Vilna Ghetto. So we're really proud to be publishing it, and we're delighted that Sam wrote the introduction to it, where he and it'll be great to hear from him tonight, but where he really lays out the significance of this diary, the context, and also just the story behind how the diary was found and discovered. So I'm delighted that we have Sam here tonight, and I'm really grateful to you, David, for facilitating this conversation. David Slucki is at the Australian Centre for Jewish Civilization. He's an author and historian specialising in 20th century Jewish history, popular culture and memoir writing. He's focused on the aftermath of the Holocaust, looking at how survivors have rebuilt their lives around the world. And he's also looked at aspects of Jewish life in Melbourne. So I'm delighted to be introducing this conversation. And just to note, there will be copies of the Rudashevski diary and previous issues for sale afterwards, I think, down there. And I think there's also a subscription offer. So please, hope you buy a copy. Please let people know about the Jewish Quarterly and encourage them to read and to subscribe. Sam and David, thanks so much for being here. Look forward to your conversation.
Thanks so much to Jonathan, Steve, and Debbie, and thanks everyone for coming out on a Tuesday night, especially when the calendar's so crowded. Sam, how about we get stuck straight into it? Tell us a little about the diary. Firstly, about what it is, who Yitskhok Rudashevski is, and what he writes about in the diary.
Well, Yitskhok Rudashevski was just a kid, and he was that last generation of Jewish young people in Poland who really grew up with Yiddish secular culture. And he grew up in this unique environment of Jewish Vilna between the wars, which was kind of the unofficial, uncrowned capital of Yiddish land. Vilna was the seat of the Evo. Vilna was known as the Jerusalem of Lithuania. Yitskhok Rudashevski went to the various Yiddish schools in Vilna. His father worked for the Vilna Tov, which was the daily Yiddish newspaper. He found himself in the Vilna Ghetto and decided to record what he saw. The diary itself is an amazing literary document. He records the fear, he records the hopes, he records the attempts of young people like himself to fight depression and despair. He is praying that somehow they'll survive the war, but of course he didn't make it. He was murdered in September 1943, or maybe early October 1943. And the diary would have been lost. But his first cousin, Sarah Voloshin, they were on a truck that was taking them to the Lukishki jail when the Germans liquidated the Vilna Ghetto in September 1943. There were about 17,000 Jews left in the ghetto. And they had a selection. They sent more than half to Sobibor to be killed. The rest were sent to concentration camps in Estonia and in Latvia. And Yitshok's family and close relatives went into a hiding place called a Molina. And they survived in the hiding place for 11 days. And then when one of them went out to get water, they were noticed by a Lithuanian. The Germans came, put them all on a truck, and took them to the Lukishki prison. And from there, the Jews would be sent to Panar to be shot. 70,000 Jews were murdered in the pits of Panar, which is a very scenic spot about 5 miles outside of Vilna. As the truck was approaching the Lukishki prison, Sarah Voloshin's mother told her to jump to save her life. And she did. Yitskok did not, and he was killed along with everybody else. Sarah, after many harrowing adventures, found herself in the partisans. When Vilna was liberated by the Red Army in July 1944, the first thing Sarah did was to go to that hiding place, to find some things that she had hidden. And as she was rummaging with her fingers in a hidden cabinet, she came across Yitzkhok's diary. And she gave that diary to Albert Sutzkever, the great Yiddish poet who survived the Vilna Ghetto, was flown in a Soviet airplane to Moscow from the forests of White Russia in 1944. Sutzkever testified at the Nuremberg trials. That's a story in and of itself. But she gave the diary to Sutzkever, and Sutzkever was already beginning to plan how he was going to get out of the Soviet Union. And he found a way to smuggle a lot of the materials from the YIVO that he and others had managed to spirit away from the Germans. And he got that diary to New York, where it became part of the YIVO collection. And it was then first published by Sutzkever himself in 1953 in a Yiddish journal called Die Goldene Kate. Now there was a problem. The problem was that Sutzkever did not feel that it was advisable to publish the diary in toto, because Yitskok, in the opening pages of the diary, was full of praise for the glorious Red Army and for the Soviet Union and for Stalin. And this, of course, was at the depths of the Cold War, 1953, when Sutzkever published the diary. To put it mildly, this would not have looked very good. It was not a good look. The alibi that many Poles and Ukrainians and Lithuanians had used for their collaboration with the Germans was that, well, yeah, maybe we didn't treat the Jews that well, but they had it coming because they collaborated with communists and so on. And so Yitzkhok's diary seemed to corroborate a lot of these anti-Semitic allegations. So Sutzkever censored these parts. And in subsequent publications, most of the censored materials were left out. So it was in the Jewish Quarterly that you have for the first time, thanks to Solon Bienfeld's wonderful translation, you have the full, uncensored version of the Rudashevski diary, which is really a great read.
So, can you tell us, we have this whole genre of Holocaust-era diaries. We know, obviously, the Diary of Anne Frank is the most celebrated and well-known. What makes this diary different from that sort of pantheon of Holocaust diaries? What makes, or differently put, what makes this so special to us today to read?
One of the things that makes Yitskhok Rudashevski's diary so fascinating is that he is totally rooted in the cultural and communal milieu of Jewish Vilna. He is a product of those Vilna Yiddish schools. He draws inspiration from the Yiddish poets and writers on both sides of the Atlantic, Mani Leib, Moshe Leib Halperin, Yehoash. He writes about Mendel Amoicher Sephorim. He represents something which today has totally disappeared. That is, Yiddish is spoken today. It's not a dying language, but as a living language, it's mostly spoken in the Hasidic milieu. The secular Yiddishism, based on this notion of Doigkeit, here's where we are, this is our home. That secular Yiddishism, which said that Jews do not have to go to Israel to be a people. That secular Yiddishism, which said that Jews do not have to be religious to be a people. And again, I'm just reporting what Yitskok and his milieu believed, and I'm not editorializing here. That secular Yiddish culture was totally destroyed in the Holocaust. And it really can't be revived. But what we see in the diary, among many other things, is the degree to which Yitskok identified with that culture. The love he had for his teachers, the love he had for the poets, the joy he took in studying Jewish history, the joy he took in staging, along with classmates, public trials of Herod and Josephus, that is, figures in Jewish history who confronted that age-old problem. If we Jews are faced with a powerful oppressor, do we bang our heads against the wall, fight and commit suicide, or do we work with the oppressor to save what we can? These trials of these figures from ancient Jewish history were obviously discussions of Jacob Gens, the head of the Vilna Ghetto, and his policy of cautious cooperation with the Germans. But Yitskok was he was very much attuned to that. He writes about the Jewish police. He writes about the corruption in the ghetto. He writes about the demoralization in the ghetto. He had very high moral standards. In retrospect, it's easy to criticize him for his seemingly naive faith in communism and in the Soviet Union. But remember that if you were a Jew in Eastern Europe under the Nazi heel in 1942 and 1943, the Red Army was your only hope. The Red Army was your only hope, nothing else. Great Britain had issued the white paper and had slammed the doors in the face of European Jewry. The United States was showing very little interest in rescuing Jews. So Jews like Yitskok put their faith in communism and the USSR, hoping naively that with the victory of the Red Army, there would be a place for the Jews in a communist Europe.
I think it's such an interesting point you make about this balance between whether it's naivety or whether that faith is justified. I think about like my own Bubba, who was about the same age, who survived in the Soviet Union and was also a communist. By the way, she was a Varshaver and didn't have very complimentary things to say about the Litvuks. But, you know, she was no Stalinist, but after the war, she maintained that, you know, it was the Soviet Union. Like, it was only because of Stalin and the Soviet Union that she could survive the war. So it's interesting to read the tension in there of, you know, we read it decades later and we see this youthful optimism in a way, and youthful naivety. And yet we sort of know what happened next, right? And we know that maybe it's not so misplaced. That's not a question. That's a like a very gentle pushing back.
Look, there were people like Shmerka Kaczerginski, who wrote many ghetto songs and who was a beloved poet. Shmerka Kaczerginski was a convinced communist. After the war, he was shocked to see how the Soviets eagerly did all they could to destroy what was left of Vilna's Jewish legacy. The old Vilna Shtochul, the great synagogue, could have been saved, and it was the Soviets that demolished it. The Yiddish books, the Yiddish documents and archives that Slucki and Kaczerginski tried to save from the Germans, burying them in the Vilna Ghetto. The Soviets were ready to turn them all into pulp. Kaczerginski and Slucki tried to set up a Jewish museum in Vilna after the liberation. The Soviets quickly ordered it shut down. So Kaczerginski very quickly understood that the Soviets were, that post-war Stalinist Soviet Union was becoming deeply anti-Semitic. And we could do the what-ifs and so on, and I'm sure that had Yitskok survived the war and had he had a chance to develop his wonderful intellectual talents, he probably would have seen the light, but that's neither here nor there. The fact is that the only hope that the Jews had was in the Red Army and in the Soviet Union at that time. Full stop.
It's really one of the tragedies when we read these kind of diaries, isn't it? That we have these incredibly talented, bright, thoughtful young people who have become frozen in time. So someone like Rudashevski becomes what's on this page as a 15-year-old, and it's almost an emblem for how the civilized, reading this diary, sorry, I'll hold it up if you didn't see earlier. Reading this diary, you kind of get this feeling of, it's not just the individual story we're reading, it's actually the story of the civilization. Which takes me to my next question, which is about Vilna, the Jerusalem of Lithuania. And you've talked about the extraordinary civilization, the Yiddish secular civilization that existed there. How does this adapt itself to the ghetto, and how is that reflected in the diary?
One of the great paradoxes of Vilna is that, on the one hand, it was a very poor city, especially in the 20th century, after the breakup of the Russian Empire. On the other hand, it had tremendous cultural vitality. And the Vilna Jews were very, very proud of who they were, which is something that drove the Polish Jews absolutely nuts. Jacob Gladstein, Jakob Gladstein, who came from Lublin, said that these Litvaks are always trying to make us feel inferior with their supposedly superior culture. But Vilna, for many reasons, Vilna punched way above its weight in the Jewish world. It was a city in the borderlands. So it was in an area where the Poles had lost power and the Russians had ruled, but there were very few Russians in the area. And so, unlike Warsaw or Krakow or Lvov, where Jews who were trying to make it made it by adopting Polish culture, in Vilna, up to World War I, Jews who were trying to make it adopted Russian culture, but there were very few Russians in the city, so there were no Russians to assimilate to. So Vilna was an ideal place to develop an independent, modern Jewish identity. It was the cradle, it was the birthplace of the Bund. It was really the cradle of East European Zionism. The modern daily Yiddish press, Moment, were created in Warsaw, but they were created by Litvaks who migrated westward in the 1880s and 1890s. Vilna had an incredible sense of collective memory. The Vilna Gaon. Now, everybody says they're descended from the Vilna Gaon, or half the people that I know say we're descended from the Vilna Gaon. I'm reminded of a doctor in my town many years ago, and he said, of course, I'm descended from the Vilna Gaon, and these are letters that we found in my grandfather's home. They're written in Yiddish. They're probably about Torah, about learning. Maybe you could tell me what they're about. And I open up the letters, you SOB, you louse, you promised that you would bring me to America and bury me, and you disappeared, may you rot in hell. So he's waiting for an answer. So, but fortunately that week was the Parsha of Vayetze, and Rashi says that why does the Bible say that Jacob leaves a particular place, naming the place? Why don't they just say Jacob left? I said, well, what this letter says is that when a great man leaves a place, he leaves a vacuum, and he's greatly missed. And so your grandfather was greatly missed. But the Vilna Gaon, of course, was a giant in Jewish history. Now, Vilna Jews, being arrogant Litvaks, were always careful to remind you that when the Vilna Gaon lived in Vilna, there were 333 Jews who knew the Talmud by heart. So to be a Gaon in Vilna, if you could make it there, you could make it anywhere. And there were many stories about the Vilna Gaon that Vilna Jews loved to tell, such as the Vilna Gaon was going through the Vilna streets, and a Jewish boy, a little boy, was running after him saying, "Gate the Vilna Gaon, gate the Vilna Gaon," that's the Vilna Gaon. And the Vilna Gaon turned around and say, "Ingele, Vilna can stay seine Gaon. Kid, if you want to, you can also be a Gaon." Now, parse that sentence. Vilna, if he wanted badly enough, that's a pun on Vilna. And of course, these Litvaks were quick to point out that Vilna means that unlike those feckless Hasidim from Galicia and central Poland who go to their rebbes and drink and dance and don't really work, the Litvaks they are told to depend on their own willpower, that nobody is going to help them. They have to figure it out for themselves. So again, that was speak Neganim safely. And so that's just one example of the collective memory. There was the legend of the Yitskhok, a Polish prince named Potocki. There are scholars who say that it's just a legend, but the legend is that Potocki converted to Judaism. And for that, he was burned at the stake. And a Jew rescued his ashes, and he was buried, his ashes were buried in the Jewish cemetery next to the Vilna Ghetto. And over the years, a oak tree began to grow behind the graves of the Vilna Ghetto and the Yitskhok. And Vilna Jews believed that in the Zechus, thanks to that spirit of the Vilna Ghetto and the Yitskhok, the Yitskhok is the holy convert, Vilna would be spared pogroms and Vilna would be spared calamities. And indeed, when the wave of pogroms swept through Ukraine in the 1880s, no pogroms in Vilna. When the waves of pogroms swept through Russia and Ukraine in 1905, no pogrom in Vilna. Somebody chopped down the tree in 1935. In Hermann Krug's diary, an entry in July 1941, it's the beginning of the German occupation. Dr. Gershuni has called together all of the elite of Vilna. He says, the Germans have ordered us to form a Judenrat. We believe that in the Zechus of the Vilna Gaon and the Yitskhok, we would be spared calamities. Unfortunately, our luck has run out, and we have no choice but to form a Judenrat. And I can go on, many examples of that collective memory. But the point I want to make is that the Jews of Vilna were able to combine this consciousness of being a great religious center with the consciousness of being a great secular center. Great pride in the Vilna Gaon, but great pride in the fact that Vilna was the birthplace of the Bund. Great pride in the Strashun library with its many manuscripts and many treasures, but also wonderful pride that Vilna was the home of the Yivo, which was founded in 1925. So as one Vilna Jew said, Max Weinreich, the director of the Yivo, before the war, Vilna had the genius of place. In Vilna given Shalom Bayis zwischen Tere und Jiddische Weltlichkeit. In Vilna there was peace, there was harmony, concord between the traditions of the Torah and the traditions of Jewish secularism.
So is this, once the ghetto is established and we face this calamity, how does that sort of shape the lives of the Jews in the ghetto? Like, we know, obviously, from the incredible work you've done in the past on the Warsaw Ghetto, we know a lot about the Onik Shabbos archive and the incredible lives that people in the Warsaw Ghetto still managed to lead. Is that reflected also in the Vilna Ghetto?
Yes and no. The first thing to remember about the ghettos is no two ghettos were alike. You take Vilna and Kovna. Kovna was only 60 miles from Vilna. But in Kovna, the Jewish elite was allowed to form a Judenrat to vote for their own representative, and this Jewish elite was in power until 1944. That meant that the Jewish leadership of the Kovna ghetto was made up of the respected leaders of the pre-war community, Emanuel Elkes, that you've all heard about. In Vilna, in the summer of 1941, the Germans murdered almost the entire first Judenrat. So they murdered the great leaders of Vilna Jewry, Yankiv Vygotsky, they murdered Gershuni. And the Vilna Jews were left without their natural leaders, and there was a terrible vacuum. That vacuum was filled by an outsider, Jacob Gens, who became a very controversial person. Gens was the head of the Vilna Jewish police. He also was the de facto head of the Vilna Judenrat. The Vilna Jews didn't know Lithuanian. Gens had been an officer in the Lithuanian army. He was married to a Lithuanian woman. They had one daughter who we got to know very well. She had an Indian food store on our corner. In fact, she was my uncle's girlfriend in Germany after the war, but that's another story.
She had an Indian food store in Hartford, Connecticut?
In West Hartford, yeah.
Wow.
And if you look at the film, The Partisans of Vilna, she is interviewed in that film. So Jacob Gens had been an officer in the Lithuanian army, and the Lithuanians, who were busy killing Jews, respected Gens because they knew that he had risked his life for Lithuanian independence. Gens told himself, if anybody is going to be in a position to help Jews, to save what can be saved, it's me. Because none of these Lithuanian Jews know any Lithuanian. I mean, none of these Vilna Jews know any Lithuanian. And so he became the boss of the Vilna Ghetto. And he was forced to do some very nasty things which Yitskhok Rudashevski condemned in his diary. For example, in October 1942, the Germans told Gens to send Jewish police to Yitskhok to do a selection. Gens said, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. Fine. And they murdered every Jew in the town. A couple of weeks later, they tell Gens, okay, send Jewish police to Oshna to do a selection. This time, Gens outfitted 30 Vilna Ghetto police, gave them nice uniforms, gave them a lot of vodka, and they went to Oshna to cull the ghetto, knowing that the Jews they selected for the wrong side would be killed. And they selected the weak and the sick and the very old people. They selected 406 Jews who were killed. And the rest of the Jews thought that they had bought some time. They returned to the ghetto. Yitskhok Rudashevski is saying, this is a black day, these people are traitors, they're monsters. Yitskhok didn't know the backstory, which is that Gens called together the Jewish intelligentsia of the Vilna Ghetto. And Gens was very drunk. And he said, I know what you people are thinking. I know what you people are saying about me behind my back. But let me tell you something. Ich mach nicht kein Chesed von Yiddish Kavod. Ich mach a Chesed von Yiddish Blut. I'm not worried so much about Jewish honor, I'm worried about Jewish lives. And if they demand that I give up 10 people so that I can save 100, I'll give up the 10. And if they demand that I give up 100 people so I can save 1,000, I'll give up 100. And then he says, I know that you nice people are going to leave the ghetto after the war. Your hands are going to be clean, and you're going to be able to look at yourselves in the mirror. But I am swimming in shit so that you people can survive. And I'll gladly do it as long as I have the chance to do it. This was an amazing talk. Now, Gens could have saved his life. Let's fast forward to September 1943. The ghetto was about to be liquidated. Neudebauer, the Gestapo chief, called Gens to his office. The Lithuanian police commander, who had a lot of Jewish blood on his hands, but like Gens, told Gens, look, they're going to shoot you. Don't go. We'll hide you. We'll save you. Remember, he had a Lithuanian wife. Gens said, no, that would be cowardly. After all that's happened, if they want to shoot me, let them shoot me. And they shot him that very day. Survivors of the Vilna Ghetto have, they have very conflicting attitudes towards Jacob Gens. He's a very tortured figure, as all of these Jewish leaders were.
So to kind of nerd out as a historian to historian here, that's one of the challenges with sources like this, right? When we read Rudashevski, and if I was teaching this to students, I would be talking about exactly these things, about like, what did he know, what could he have known, what can a 15-year-old, and no offense to 15-year-old boys, but they're 15-year-old boys. What do we do with a source like that as a historian when we want to tell that story of someone like Gens, and we know the story is so morally complicated, but the contemporary sources tell us that he was this sort of unrepentant monster? How do we treat a source like this diary when we're reconstructing life in the Vilna Ghetto?
We use it as one source. And we have to use other sources. And we know that, say, Mendel Berberishki, who settled in Melbourne after the war, he wrote a memoir, Stärke von Eisen, and he hates Gens. Dr. Mark Dvorzhetsky, who survived the Vilna Ghetto and the camps, settled in Israel, taught at Bar-Ilan University. He was much more complimentary to Gens. The judgments about Jacob Gens run the gamut. What we learn from Yitshok's diary is that many Jews in the Vilna Ghetto were very angry at Gens. They could not forgive him what they believed were the excesses, the privileges, the corruption of the Jewish police, the way the Jewish police got better food, the way the Jewish police strutted around. But at the same time, if you read Rudashevski's diary very carefully, you see that even this 16-year-old kid was not always sure about his particular judgments. An example, one of the most hated Jews in the Vilna Ghetto was a Jew named Meyer Levas. He was the commander of the Jewish police who patrolled the gates. And everything depended on the food getting smuggled into the gate and into the ghetto by the workers who were returning to the ghetto from their daily work assignments. Every once in a while, the monsters would appear at the gate. Weiss, Maurer. By the way, these monsters died in bed. Weiss was, he was, I think, tried and acquitted. Maurer was tried and acquitted, but that's neither here nor there. When these Germans appeared at the gate, sometimes they would arbitrarily, unpredictably, order everybody strip searched. And of course, people who had food on them would be sent to the Lukishki prison and sometimes murdered. One example being Luba Levitska, who was the most popular singer in the Vilna Ghetto. They found her with a pocket full of peas, and for that they shot her. Now, Levas, who was this hated man, when the Germans were there, when the Germans were in the vicinity, he would take his truncheon and he would mercilessly beat the Jews in the face, leaving them terribly bloody. But people began to notice that when Levas was whipping Jews in front of the Germans smiled and they walked away. And the Jews were allowed, very bloody, to go home. And Yitskhok Rudashevski is saying, okay, Levis is a monster, but is he really a monster? The fact is, there are those who say that he has to beat Jews to save their lives. And of course, this doubt is taking shape in his head that it's not black and white. Had he been older, he probably would have expressed those doubts with even greater clarity. But nothing in the Vilna Ghetto was simple. One of the terrible ordeals that Yitskhok Rudashevski had to go through was in October 1941. This was the month of the Gelbe Scheine, the yellow certificates. The Germans announced at the end of September that they were going to issue 3,000 yellow certificates. Each holder of the yellow certificate was entitled to take a spouse and 2 kids. So if you had 4 kids, you had to decide which of the 2 kids you were going to abandon and which of the 2 kids you were going to take. If you could not take parents on your certificate. And you could imagine the tension that each office, each institution in the ghetto was allowed so many yellow certificates. Mark Dvorzhetsky, a doctor, remembered sitting in the anteroom of the Judenrat with another doctor who'd been a friend, they'd been friends their entire lives, and they knew that only one of them would get the yellow certificate. And Dvorzhetsky got it, he took it, he walked out, he couldn't look at his friend in the eyes, but Dvorzhetsky wrote, if it had been him, he would have done the same thing. So anyway, Yitskhok and the family at first did not have a yellow certificate. And when the Germans searched for all those without the yellow certificates, they went into a hiding place or a molina. And Yitskhok describes how 60 Jews are hiding, and the Lithuanians and Germans are in the building with flashlights, and a baby starts to cry. And all the Jews are demanding from the mother that she suffocate the baby, that they go crazy with fear. And then finally, they make it that day. But then a couple days later, Yitzchak's mother procures a certificate. The problem is they have to abandon the grandmother. Yitskhok loved his mother. He loved his grandmother. And Yitskhok describes how they are marching from Ghetto 1 to Ghetto 2. All the lucky holders of the yellow certificate would be allowed to stay in Ghetto 2. And the grandmother is standing in the middle of the street saying, don't abandon me, don't abandon me. And they turned their back on her and walked into Ghetto 2. And Yitskhok could never get that out of his mind. Now, Sarah Voloshin, who discovered the diary, recalled that in the last months of his life, Yitskhok became very depressed, finally. He was fighting off depression. He was full of hope. He was full of optimism. But in those last months, he began to get more and more depressed. And he said, I want to be with my grandmother once again. The fact is, the last diary entry is in April 1943. What happened in April 1943 was really terrible. It marked the end of what was called the quiet period of the Vilna Ghetto. They had deported 5,000 Jews from surrounding shtetls into the Vilna Ghetto in March 1943. So the ghetto now became impossibly crowded. And Gens then announced that the 5,000 would be sent to the Kovna Ghetto, where there was a real need for labor. And Gens told these Jews, you're safe, you'll be okay in Kovna, and just to prove that you're safe, I'm going to go with you. just to guarantee your safety. The fact is that the German authorities in the Vilna Ghetto really wanted those 5,000 Jews to come because they were building an airfield and they needed the labor. But what happened? At the last minute, the SS said, these Jews are coming from towns east of Vilna where there's already a strong Soviet partisan movement. They're a security risk. The train left Vilna. There were 80 cars. It went 5 miles to Panar. It didn't go to Kovno. The Jews jumped out of the cars. They attacked the Germans and Lithuanians with hammers, with their bare fists. It was a total massacre. Gens saw it all. Gens was humiliated by this massacre. He had told the Jews in Vilna, if you work hard, if you're disciplined, we will be able to survive the war. These 5,000 Jews were workers. They were young. If the Germans were murdering them, what hope was there for the Jews in the Vilna Ghetto? And the last entry in Yitshok's diary is just after that happened. And he realizes that the illusion of safety was just that. It was just an illusion.
Just taking a breath after that. I want to open for questions now.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, I have so many more questions I want to ask, but I will hand over to Deb.
Are there questions? No?
I can keep asking.
We've got, yeah, here's one.
There seems to be a lot of parallels between Yitskhok Rudashevski in the Lodge Ghetto and his attitude towards Rumkowski with what was going on in Vilna. It seems very similar diaries.
There's a real difference between Rumkowski and Gens. Rumkowski, of course, also saw himself as somebody who was going to buy time and help Jews survive. But as an individual, Rumkowski had terrible flaws, which Gens did not have. For example, Rumkowski would use his power to extort sexual favors. Rumkowski would put opponents or troublemakers on deportation lists. Rumkowski had ghetto stamps. Rumkowski had ghetto poets writing poems showing how wonderful he was. Rumkowski had ghetto artists painting pictures of Rumkowski as the benign protector of the Lodge Ghetto. Gens never went in for that kind of thing. Their philosophy was the same: work hard and maybe we will survive. But as individuals, they were very, very different. Gens never had this complex that Rumkowski had. At least that's my opinion. Now there are people who would differ, but
Rumkowski could have saved 70,000 if the Russians had arrived in time.
well, I'll go. Look, it's so hard to judge, right? I mean, when Adam Chernyakov, the head of the Warsaw Judenrat, was ordered to assist in the deportations, he committed suicide. He said, "I'm not going to lend a hand to the murder of our children." In September 1942, the Germans told Rumkowski, "We're going to deport all kids under 10 and all old people over 65. And there was a 1-week lockdown in the Lodge Ghetto, to spare it. Some of you probably have parents in the Lodge Ghetto, I don't know. And that was a week of hell. So Rumkowski, however, wheeled and dealed. There were 117 different factories in the Lodge Ghetto. And by wheeling and dealing, the Lodz Ghetto survived until August 1944. The Red Army was only 60 miles away. But there's something else to think about. On July 20th, 1944, a bomb almost killed Hitler, right? Had an officer not taken the suitcase with the bomb and took it to the other end of the oak table, Hitler would have been killed. Had Hitler been killed on July 20th, I believe that the mass murder of Jews would have ended. I mean, we don't have to get into the reasons why, but take it from me. I think the mass murder would have ended. And you would have had 70,000 Jews alive in the Lodz Ghetto. Now, Rumkowski, as Gens, by the way, Gens and Rumkowski always said, I'm happy to face a Jewish court after the war. I'm happy to face the music. I want people to judge me. But what would we have said about Rumkowski had 70,000 Jews survived in the Lodz Ghetto? Now, unlike Chernyakov, who killed himself, and it made no difference whatsoever, Rumkowski helped in the deportation of Jewish kids. And we say, well, he's a monster. But on the other hand, his policies or his wheeling and dealing, had the bomb killed Hitler, or had the Red Army gone another 60 miles, you would have had 70,000 survivors of the Lodz Ghetto. And there's another thing that I want to point out. Ask yourself this: why was it that in the Vilna Ghetto, the resistance was better armed than the Jewish fighting organization in the Warsaw Ghetto? But they had no support from the ghetto population. In the showdown on July 16, 1943, between the FPO, the United Partisan Organization, and Gens, the Jews of the Vilna Ghetto supported Gens and not the idea of armed resistance. The Jews of the Vilna Ghetto felt that these kids with guns were a calamity. They were going to result in the destruction of the entire ghetto. They called them the Pishers mit die Bixen, the little Pishers with the guns. After the war in the DP camps, Jews from Vilna and everywhere else saying the partisan songs, "Sag mich kein Molast against the letzten Weg." But in the war itself, if you were in a ghetto, like the Bialystok ghetto with Baruch, or in the Vilna ghetto with Gens, and you had a Judenrat leader who was somehow enabling you to get through the day, to have enough food, to have work, to tell you, who knows, maybe a miracle will happen. Meanwhile, let's play for time. And some kid says, let's shoot Germans and go down fighting for Jewish honor. And you're Mottel the tailor, you're working in a tailor shop for the Wehrmacht, and you've just gotten 6 months worth of new orders to make uniforms. Are you going to want to die for Jewish honor, or are you going to hope against hope that Gens or Baruch knows what they're talking about and they're going to give you hope to survive? The reason why the Battle of the Warsaw Ghetto became, quote unquote, the Battle of the Warsaw Ghetto was because the Jewish civilians supported armed resistance. They did it because there was no Jewish leadership outside the Jewish fighting organization. And they built 750 bunkers. It was those 750 bunkers which meant that the fighting in the ghetto lasted for a month. Otherwise, it would have lasted for a day.
Amazing. Any more questions, or shall we go straight to the signing? Because I think we're going to have 3 or 4 more events with Sam, and I encourage everyone to go to those events because there's so much to learn. And do you want to?
There is one question that I hope might come up that I didn't get, so sorry. Sorry, Sam. The question's about the Lithuanians. It's clear what Rudashevski thinks about Lithuanians from almost the first page in this.
Not much.
Right. And you mentioned it in your framing comments about why Sutzkever took out those references to the Soviet Union, but like clearly it thinks the Lithuanians are barbarians, and that sort of shapes its reception in Lithuania ultimately, right? So can you just really briefly tell us a little bit about how he writes about Lithuanians and then how that impacts whether this gets read in Lithuania or not, and how?
Well, if you read the diary carefully, you see that every once in a while, Yitskhok is writing about quote-unquote good Germans. They make cameo appearances. The Lithuanians are invariably portrayed as killers. He has nothing good to say about Lithuanians. Now, the fact is that the Holocaust really began in Lithuania. Between June 1941 and December 1941, of the 260,000 Jews in Lithuania, including the Vilna area, 220,000 were murdered. This is before the mass murders began in Central Poland or in Europe, and most of the actual shooting was done by Lithuanians. Now, many Lithuanians will say, wait a minute, it was German supervision and so on. I'm not going to get into that. The Germans attacked the Soviet Union on Sunday, June 22nd. Their tanks came into Vilna and Kovna on Tuesday, 2 days. So it was very difficult to run. Running was almost impossible. On Wednesday, the first full day of German occupation, a group of Lithuanian nationalists led by a thug named Clemaitis, who lived to a ripe old age in Hamburg, went into Slobodka, the old Jewish section of Kovna, and murdered 1,000 Jews with saws, with sledgehammers, sawing people in half. This was the first full day. 2 days later, in the Leotukas garage, they grabbed Jews off the street and they smashed their skulls in, and people were taking pictures. Within 2 weeks, in Kovna itself, about 7,000 Jews have been murdered, mostly by Lithuanians. So it's a bloody, bloody record. Now, of course, not all Lithuanians were like that. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, it turns out that there were Lithuanian librarians and intellectuals who saved Jewish books, saved Jewish archives. Much of the Evo archive was saved thanks to Lithuanian intellectuals. And the problem was, though, that in Lithuania, many of the great heroes who fought the Soviets were also some of the greatest killers of Jews. And so they had statues and they named streets after murderers. And it's been a very tough fight to get Lithuania to confront the legacy of the Holocaust. And what many Lithuanians talk about is the double genocide. We were victims of Soviet genocide, you Jews were victims of Nazi genocide, but you Jews helped the Soviets in their genocide. So why don't we just say we're even and call it quits? Now, if you had asked me 2 months ago, I would have said, but the fact is that in Lithuanian schools and Lithuanian universities, there are bona fide efforts to really start telling the story of Lithuanian Jewry. However, just in the last week, I don't know if any of you have heard this, but the Social Democratic led government in Lithuania was desperate to form a coalition So just as Bibi, to form his coalition, brought in Ben Gvir, who was not allowed to serve in the army because he was a nut job, but he's Minister of Internal Security, go figure that out. They invited in Lithuania the so-called Dawn of the Nieman Party, Žemaitaitis. This is a viciously anti-Semitic party. They say that the issue of Lithuanian collaboration is a red herring. They supported these bogus charges against Jewish survivors on the grounds that they helped murder Lithuanians when they were in the Soviet partisan movement. For a short time, a Lithuanian prosecutor was talking about indicting Yitskhok Rudashevski, who'd been former head of Yad Vashem. So this party is now in the Lithuanian government. And there we are. This guy is basically a Holocaust revisionist. So stay tuned.
I did not catch that because a week ago I stopped reading the news, so I don't know what's happening in the world. There's been a few elections, it sounds like. All right, that landed pretty flat. I'll hand back over to Debbie to wrap up.
I think we can just go straight to book signing, and you can ask Sam questions directly, but you'll have to let people, move on. I mean, all of your answers are phenomenal. Everything you say, it's just whet the appetite really, but as I say, we've got about 3 or 4 other events to continue this conversation, so thank you very, very much. Thank you, David.